Shabbat Shalom, everyone. This is much better. I like this now. You know, we were delaying and we were slowing down. It took us a while to all get here, but now we're showing up. I like it. I think we may have to start telling people that services start at 8:30, and then everyone get here by 9 o'clock, and we'll be good to go. I want to talk a little bit today about Shabbat. Now, why do I want to talk about Shabbat? Because the mention of Shabbat in this week's Parsha seems like it's out of place, right? If we open up to our Torah portion for today, it's in the other red books, the larger of the red books. We're on page 552. It begins at the very first pasuk or second pasuk. Moses brought the whole people of Israel together, and he said to them, "These are the things the Lord has commanded you. On 6 days work may be done, but on the seventh you shall have a Shabbat of complete rest." Okay? Now, where does this come? If you listen to the podcast this week, we spoke a little bit about it. It comes after the golden calf, right? We just read the golden calf at the end of last week's portion. And immediately after this, it goes back into talking about the building of the Mishkan, the building of the tabernacle in the desert. So why is Shabbat stuck here, it seems, in the middle of all of this? Why did Moshe feel the need, when he gathered everybody together after the golden calf, to start with Shabbat? And it's interesting, I'm going to let you answer that in a second, so be thinking about the answer to that question. It's interesting, what day of the week is Shabbat? Seventh day. It says it here. But actually, I was reading Rabbi Sachs's commentary on this, and he makes an interesting argument. Shabbat is the seventh day from the perspective of God. It's the first day from the perspective of human beings. It's the first full day that we had, right? Because we were created on the sixth day, towards the end of the sixth day. We were the last thing that was created. And then Shabbat came. So the first full day for us as human beings, day one, was Shabbat. But the seventh day, if we think about it, that is coming from the perspective of God, not from the perspective of human beings. So let's talk a little bit, because the rabbis asked this question: what is the law of Shabbat doing right here in the middle of this? It makes sense back in the Ten Commandments. It makes sense in Deuteronomy when we're talking about all of that. But why here? Why do we think it's important to have Shabbat at this moment between the golden calf and creating or continuing to build the Mishkan? What do we think? What are the possibilities? Say it again? They were tired, they needed to rest. Maybe they were tired from all the revelry with the golden calf. That's a whole different issue, right? Maybe they were tired because they were building the Mishkan, but they needed to rest. Good. What else? Shabbat is the core of all of this. I agree with that 100%. Why do you say that, though? Yeah. What makes it the core? I mean, there could be a lot of things that are the core, but we chose Shabbat as one of the core, so why? Yeah?
It's a time for us to stop and connect, and the connection is one of the most fundamental parts of Judaism.
Awesome. It is a time for us to stop and connect. Connection is one of the most essential parts of Judaism. This parasha is called Vayakel, which means we all came together, right? We all came together. And we're going to talk a little bit about that as I introduce you guys later for Hadassah, because that's part of what you all do, right? We all came together, and Shabbat is one of those things that enables us to do that helps us to do that.
I think we're at a point in the story where Shabbat makes sense as well, because we begin Shabbat by reflecting.
Mm-hmm.
The next Shabbat we're talking about how we're unfolding. And I think there's a piece of an inflection point where we're at in the story. Maybe taking a break makes sense.
I like that, Brett. So what Brett said, just for those of our viewers who are playing along in our home game, Shabbat is sort of a transition point. The beginning of Shabbat, we reflect back. At the end of Shabbat, we're looking forward. And this is really kind of that inflection transition point as well, looking back on, hey, we didn't do such a great thing last week, right? Golden calf. Looking forward on, well, this is really how we're supposed to be moving forward and worshiping God and those sorts of things. I like that. Anybody else? Why? Why Shabbat here? Please, Ebony. Yeah. Yeah, it kind of makes sense if you think about it. If you're thinking about the idea of shuvah, of returning, right? It makes sense that we were far away from where we needed to be. We were building this golden calf. We said, this is God, right? And now it's like, all right, let's go back to our basics, right? Every once in a while, we need to go back to basics. Good. Anybody else? Lori. Right. You know, again, it's putting us back on that right track, so to speak, after we're done doing all of this stuff, right, that we're not supposed to do. It reminds us that this is the way we do it, right? This is who we are as Jews. And if we think about it, there are two aspects to that, right? As Jews, we think about two different domains of the sacred. And this is something that Yitz Greenberg in his commentary on this parsha talks about, right? We think about sacred space and we think about sacred time as Jews, right? Sacred space, the buildings that we go, we create that sacred space, we're aware of it. We create sacred spaces by putting a mezuzah up on our house, right? We think about the spaces that we're in a very meaningful way. It's not just any old space. We are aware of where we are aware of our surroundings, and we actively work to create a surroundings that is going to be conducive to our life as Jews. That's in the real world or in the physical world, right? Sacred space. The Mishkan, the tabernacle, is about sacred space. It's about creating that space in the desert for the children of Israel. But that's not the only place that we as Jews focus. We create sacred time as well. And that is through the life cycle events, through the scope of the holidays, and most importantly, through Shabbat. And if we think about it, after this abject failure that we had as a people, what are the two things that Moshe is bringing us back to remind us of? How do we create sacred time? How do we create sacred space? The way that it's supposed to be, not the way that we did it last week, right? And by the way, let's understand that the failure of the golden calf was in both aspects. It was in the physical world, they built a golden calf. But what was the failure? What was the origin of that failure? Why did they build the golden calf? Yeah, Barbara, say it again louder. Because they were waiting for Moshe. They lost track of the sacred time, right? He was supposed to be up there for 40 days. They lost track of the sacred time. They got afraid because they weren't keyed in to the sacred space and the sacred time, and they lost their moorings because of it. So for us today, as we end the book of Exodus and we get into the book of Vayikra, Next week, you will hear Rabbi Ernst and my podcast about Vayikra, and there is this. I think we mentioned it on the podcast. You can sort of hear the moan and groan from all of my colleagues as we're like, how are we going to talk about all these sacrifices for all these times, right? These stories are much easier to talk about on a week-to-week basis, but those sacrifices are about what we do in the physical world and actually how we connect sacred time and sacred space together. And it makes sense. It makes sense. We as Jews are incomplete if all we do is think about the space around us. It's great that we have a mezuzah up on our wall. It's great that we do all those sorts of things. But if we're not connected into sacred time, we've really lost something essential. Whether it's the holidays, whether it's the life cycles, whether it's just the rhythm of rest and recuperation that Shabbat gives us. We've lost something as human beings and as Jews if we don't find a way to connect into that. By the same token, if we don't have a space that we can come together and be Jewish, we've lost something as well. We can't do that. We need both. And that's why I think this week's Parsha, as we end Exodus, and remember, what's going to happen now after the golden calf? We're not going to have our own space, at least for a while. We're going to be wandering. We're going to be wandering now for 40 years in the desert. No space other than what we build for ourselves. One could also maybe even argue no time yet, because it's hard to keep those rhythms like that when you're out in the wilderness. How do we as Jews connect to time? We've got a holiday coming up. It's a holiday of Passover. Yes, it talks about a story, but it's also about the seasons. All of our holidays are agricultural. It's our connection into the time. Until we have land, it's harder to do that. Farmers are very connected to time. We know. They feel it. They feel the rhythms. They don't need to look at a calendar. They feel it in their bones because they're connected to it. They know, not because the farmer's almanac tells them it's time to plant. They look outside, they sniff the wind, and they say, okay, now it's time to plant, right? The more we can find ourselves connected to both space and time, the more robust, the more meaningful our connection as Jews is. And so, Shabbat helps us to do that. The Mishkan helps us to do that. Now, that Mishkan is transferred into this place, right, where we come together to learn, to play, to pray, all those sorts of things, because we need that space to feel free and comfortable to do that. For me, it's a powerful way to end the book of Exodus before we really go into now the details of what it means to keep Jewish rhythms, right, through the sacrifices, until we get to Parashat Kedoshim, where it talks about Jewish rhythms of interhuman discourse and connection. All of Vayikra is about figuring out those rhythms that are now set up at the end of the book of Exodus. Any comments or questions before we actually go and read from Vayakhel? All right, well, Shabbat Shalom, everyone.